Hello everybody, my name is Jay and I'll be teaching you beginning Java lesson 4. Alright, so we have some review first of all. What do we do to pick a random number? So we actually use the function called math.random, which returns a double that is between a given range. And we often want an int, not a double, so you can typecast it into an int. What is the difference between an if and an else if statement? An if statement just checks for one condition, while an else if statement only checks for the condition if the previous condition wasn't true. Alright, so an overview of today's lesson, we're going to be doing functions/methods, and we're going to be learning about the random function. So let's think for a second. What if we want to check if a given string has a certain character? Well, here we can see some unfinished code, and we have a few blanks to fill in. So first, we're going to use for because this is a for loop, and then for the condition, I is less than string to check dot length. And then finally, if string to check dot char at I equals j, then system.out.println yay. So essentially what this code is doing is you have a for loop with I starting at 0 and then going up to string to check.length minus 1. So for every single character in string.check, it's going to check if that character is equal to j, then it's going to print out yay. But what if we're not just curious about whether j is in hello, my name is Jeff? We want to see if any given character is contained in any given string. So how do we fix this so that it doesn't just apply to our current situation? For example, you can see here that we're specifically talking about this specific string to check, and we're specifically talking about the character j. Well, we can make it into a function. Functions can also be known as methods. So why are functions so useful? They essentially isolate the main function of the code. So you could check for a letter in a certain string, count to a certain number, or sort something. And this way, the code doesn't have to be repeated over and over. So how do we actually make a function? Well, first, in the main method right here, you're going to call name of function, and then two parentheses, and then a semicolon. And inside these parentheses, you're going to put in what's called your parameters. So this is all of the information that the function needs in order to personalize that function. So for example, if a function is counting to a certain number, in between these parentheses, you would put in that number so the function knows what to count to. And then how to actually write a function, you have three words right here. In this case, it's public static void. Then you have the name of the function, two parentheses with all the parameters that you want, and then your code inside here. So what are these three words? Well, first you have public. So this is telling you it could be public, it could be private. Basically, it's telling you who has access to this function, who can actually call this function. If it's private, you can only call it if it's in the same class. If it's public, more people have access to it. So this sort of tells you whether or not people can access it if it's just in the project or just in that specific class. Next, we have static. So if you have the word static here, it's telling you that this function applies to the exact same thing every single time. So for example, in name of function, it's going to do the exact same thing every single time to whatever numbers are put in here. But if you don't have the word static, then it's what's called an instance function. It's talking about instance variables. So in that case, you would have some sort of object, and you would say object name dot name of function, and that is how you would call it. And in that case, it would be specifically referring to that object when you're performing that function. And we'll talk more about instance related functions in a second. And finally, void. So this is the return type. In this case, this function is a void return type, meaning it doesn't return anything. But you could also put int or double or boolean or whatever you'd like here. And it's just going to return a value of that type. So here are some example functions. What do these functions do and how are they different? Well, let's look at them. First, print to 10. You see int I is starting at 1 and it's going up until it's 10. And then each time it's printing out I. And this function does the exact same thing, except it takes in a parameter, int num, and then instead of going up to 10, it goes up to num. And because it goes up to num, this is a perfect example of how you can actually personalize a function. So if you were to put in 10 here, it would count up to 10, but if you were to put in 20, for example, then it would count up to 20. And this is an example of a parameter. All right, let's explore some functions. So first of all, calling functions. Functions aren't actually executed until they're actually called. So this means we have to write something like function to call and then parameters inside of main. So a function is like a machine, but that machine won't turn on or do anything unless we turn it on. So we need to call the function in our main method. Alright, your turn. So our goal here is to create a function that rolls a die with a given amount of sides. So let's look at what we would do to make our dice rolling function. Public static something dice roll something. So here, this is the return type. What are we trying to return here? Well, let's go back to the description of the function. So it rolls a die with a given amount of sides. So that indicates that we're going to return the value of the dice roll. So in that case, we're probably going to return an int. Next, for parameters, what do we actually have to tell this function in order for it to execute? Well, let's look back. It says with a given amount of sides. Therefore, we know that it must need to know the number of sides, so we're going to input that as our parameter. But what do we actually put inside this function? Well, let's give some examples. We could print out a roll from a 6-sided dice, an 8-sided dice, a 100-sided dice. In the end, our answer would be, after calling this function in main multiple times with different numbers of sides, we can see that inside this function, we would return typecasting int math.random times sides plus 1. So first, we're doing math.random, and then multiplying it by sides. So right here, this is going to generate something from 0 to sides minus 1. Then we add 1, so it's instead going to from 1 to sides. Finally, we typecast this to an int. That way, when we're returning it, we're returning an int instead of a double, so we're matching this return type here. Alright, finally, let's go over some review. 1. Name at least 2 things that need to be specified when creating a function. So here are all the possible answers. You could say whether it's public, whether it's static, its return type, its name, and its parameters. How do we call a function and where do we call the function? Well, we call it by saying function name and then putting the parameters. And where? We call it in the main method or in another function. So we didn't actually talk about this explicitly, but you can actually call a function inside another function. So for example, if I were calling the function make pancakes in the main method, and inside the function make pancakes, I could actually call another function, say stir batter, and that would be okay. So you can actually call functions inside of other functions. Finally, why are functions useful? Functions help you prevent repeating code and make your code more readable. Alright, that's it for this lesson. So as a reminder, we have Tuesday and Sunday office hours from 4:15 to 5:15 p.m. So if you have any questions or you need any help, feel free to hop on, and this is the Zoom meeting ID. Thank you guys for watching.